James Carter had never considered himself a hero. He was simply a man doing his best to survive one day at a time while raising his 8-year-old son, Ethan, alone after losing his wife 3 years ago. His life revolved around early mornings at the construction site, long hours of labor under the hot sun, and evenings spent making simple dinners, helping Ethan with his homework, and tucking him into bed with a promise that tomorrow would be better. But one stormy evening, after finishing an overtime shift to scrape together enough money for Ethan's school trip, fate tested him in a way he never expected. The rain was pounding so hard that his old pickup truck wipers could barely keep up as he drove along the nearly deserted country road. Out of nowhere, headlights ahead veered violently before a silver car slammed into a tree with a deafening crash. James's heart lurched as he slammed on the brakes and pulled over to the side. Adrenaline surged through him, overriding the exhaustion in his bones. Without hesitation, he jumped out into the storm, grabbed the rusty crowbar from his truck, and sprinted toward the wreckage. Smoke hissed from the crumpled hood, and the faint smell of gasoline mixed with burning wires filled the air. "Is anyone in there?" he shouted desperately, yanking on the door handle, but it was jammed. Through the shattered glass, he saw a young woman slumped over the steering wheel, blood trickling down her forehead. She wasn't moving. Panic tightened his chest, but James forced himself to focus. He couldn't let her die. Bracing his legs, he jammed the crowbar into the gap of the door and heaved with all his strength. The metal screeched and groaned before finally giving way with a sharp pop. Rain drenched him as he pulled the woman into his arms, shielding her fragile body from the cold pelting drops. The moment he carried her a few steps away, flames erupted from the engine, spreading rapidly as if the car itself were determined to consume her. James stumbled back with her cradled against him, coughing from the smoke, his boots slipping in the mud. Kneeling on the ground, he checked her pulse, praying. Relief washed over him when he felt the faint, unsteady beat under his fingertips. "You're going to be okay," he murmured, though he didn't even know if she could hear him. In the distance, the wail of sirens grew louder until flashing lights cut through the storm. Paramedics rushed in, carefully taking her from his arms and loading her into the ambulance. One of them glanced back at James and said with conviction, "If you hadn't gotten her out when you did, she wouldn't have survived." James stood there, drenched, trembling, and utterly speechless as the ambulance sped off into the night. He had no idea who she was, where she came from, or how their paths had crossed on that lonely road, but he had risked his life to save a stranger, unaware that she was far more connected to his world than he could ever imagine. The following morning, James tried to shake off the events of the stormy night, convincing himself it had been nothing more than a terrifying accident that he had simply stumbled into, yet the image of the unconscious woman haunted him with every step, her pale face, the weight of her in his arms, and the terrifying moment when the flames devoured her car replayed in his mind as though he were trapped inside a nightmare. He didn't tell Ethan about what had happened, not wanting to frighten his son, but he caught himself staring blankly at his coffee, lost in thought until Ethan's cheerful chatter pulled him back to reality. At the construction site, however, whispers spread like wildfire. A few workers huddled around, speaking in low voices about the near-fatal accident of Emily Donovan, the only daughter of Richard Donovan, the powerful CEO of the company James worked for. James felt a chill trickle down his spine at the mention of her name, though he quickly brushed it aside. After all, what were the chances that the stranger he had dragged from the burning wreck was the same Emily Donovan? The idea seemed absurd, and yet something inside him told him it was more than coincidence. His suspicion deepened when the foreman gathered the crew at noon and relayed the CEO's message. His usually gruff voice softened with solemnity. "Mr. Donovan asked me to thank everyone for their concern. His daughter is alive because a man pulled her out of her car before it exploded. They don't know who he is, but they're looking for him." James felt heat rush to his face as every pair of eyes seemed to search for the mystery savior among them, but he quickly bent back to his work, hammering nails with unnecessary force, determined to stay invisible. Yet destiny refused to let him hide. Later that afternoon, while James picked up supplies from the hospital's storage dock, an errand his foreman often handed him, he overheard two nurses chatting near the entrance about Emily being in critical care but stable. Their words stirred both guilt and longing inside him, guilt because he had slipped away without waiting for her family, and longing because he wanted to make sure she was truly all right. But what could a man like him say to a woman like her? That evening, as James returned home to his small apartment, carrying groceries and Ethan's favorite cereal, there was an unexpected knock on the door. Standing outside was a tall man in a perfectly tailored black suit, his expression unreadable under the dim hallway light. "James Carter?" the man asked formally. James nodded slowly, tightening his grip on the grocery bag. The man extended a sleek business card embossed with gold letters. "Mr. Richard Donovan would like to meet you." James's stomach dropped, and for a moment, the world tilted on its axis. The stranger he had saved wasn't just anyone, she was the daughter of the very man who controlled his livelihood. His simple act of humanity had suddenly bound him to a world far beyond his own, a world of wealth and power that he had never dared to step into. The next morning, James found himself standing uneasily in the opulent marble lobby of Donovan Enterprises, clutching Ethan's small hand as if it were the only anchor keeping him grounded in a world that felt far too grand for a man like him, his work boots squeaking faintly against the polished floor while executives in expensive suits strode past without a glance. He had wanted to leave Ethan at home, but when his son begged to come, James couldn't say no, knowing Ethan rarely had the chance to see beyond their modest neighborhood. They were led through towering glass doors into a private office where Richard Donovan himself, a tall man with a commanding presence and eyes sharp as steel, rose from behind a massive mahogany desk. "Mr. Carter," Richard said, his tone softer than his reputation suggested, "you saved my daughter's life. I owe you a debt that can never truly be repaid." James shifted uncomfortably, unused to such gratitude, and replied with quiet humility, "I just did what anyone would have done." Before Richard could respond, the door opened and Emily walked in, her presence immediately shifting the air in the room. She wore a pale blue dress, her arms still in a sling, and though her face was marred by cuts and bruises, her eyes lit up when they landed on James. "It's you," she breathed, her voice trembling as she stepped closer. "You're the man who carried me out." For a moment, the noise of the world faded as James nodded awkwardly, unsure of what to say, until Emily's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "You didn't just save me, you gave me a second chance." Over the days that followed, Emily insisted on seeing James again, surprising him by visiting his small apartment and even bringing little gifts for Ethan, who quickly warmed to her gentle smile and playful nature. She wasn't the spoiled heiress James had imagined, she was kind, grounded, and eager to spend time in their modest world, laughing with Ethan over board games and helping him with his school projects as though she had known them both for years. Slowly, a bond began to form between them, fragile yet undeniable, and James found himself looking forward to her visits in a way that scared him. But not everyone shared their warmth. Richard, though eternally grateful, grew uneasy watching his daughter step deeper into the life of a construction worker. One evening, after Emily returned from visiting James, Richard sat her down in the sprawling Donovan estate. "Emily," he began carefully, "James is a good man, but you must understand, our worlds are different. He cannot give you the life you deserve." Emily met her father's gaze with quiet defiance, her voice steady despite the emotions roiling inside her. "Dad, he risked his life for me without even knowing who I was. That tells me more about his character than all the wealth in the world ever could." And with that, the invisible line between two vastly different worlds grew thinner, even as the tension between love and class threatened to pull them apart. As the weeks turned into months, James found himself caught between disbelief and wonder, unable to fully grasp how his life had shifted from anonymity to being woven into the orbit of one of the city's most powerful families, and yet despite his hesitations, Emily continued to close the distance between their worlds with her warmth, her visits to his modest apartment becoming a source of joy for both him and Ethan, who had grown attached to her in a way that made James's heart ache with both fear and hope. He tried to convince himself it was temporary, that once Emily healed she would retreat back into her life of wealth and privilege, but each time she laughed with Ethan or looked at James with those earnest eyes, the wall he had built around his heart crumbled a little more. The turning point came when Emily invited James and Ethan to a charity gala hosted by her father, insisting that they belonged there even when James argued otherwise. "You saved my life, James," she told him firmly, her hand resting gently on his arm, "and you've given me something even more valuable since, hope. You belong in my world more than you think." Reluctantly, he agreed, and on the night of the gala, James stood awkwardly in a borrowed suit while Ethan beamed with pride beside him, his small hands fidgeting with his bow tie as if he had been waiting his whole life for this moment. The grand ballroom glittered with chandeliers and laughter, and whispers quickly rippled through the crowd at the sight of the Donovan heiress arriving with a construction worker and his little boy, but Emily walked proudly at James's side, unbothered by the judgmental stares. Midway through the evening, Richard Donovan pulled James aside to a quiet corner, his face solemn but his voice carrying a weight of sincerity James hadn't expected. "I had you investigated," Richard admitted bluntly, his eyes searching James's, "because I wanted to protect my daughter. But what I found was a man who has carried burdens most wouldn't survive, a man who sacrificed everything for his son and still found the strength to risk his life for a stranger. That is the kind of man I want near my daughter." James's throat tightened, words caught in the storm of emotion surging through him, and before he could respond, Richard extended his hand, not as a CEO but as a father acknowledging another man's worth. By the end of the night, as Ethan fell asleep on Emily's lap in the back of the car, James realized something had shifted permanently. Emily wasn't just a woman he had saved, she was becoming part of their family, filling a space that had long been empty. Later, as they stood outside his apartment, Emily whispered softly, "You saved me that night, James, but maybe I was meant to find you too." And for the first time in years, James allowed himself to believe that fate hadn't just tested him on that stormy night, it had given him the chance to rewrite his future, not as a struggling single dad alone in the world, but as a man with love, family, and a new beginning.